Good evening and welcome to the 8th Flop 26 live stream. Many thanks for watching, and of course many thanks to the supporters of this project, without whom this would not be possible. Please consider supporting if you can, and either way, please subscribe to the channel and like the videos, because that helps us with the algorithms and all that. And please share the content. That's the most important thing. We want to as many people as possible to see these discussions. Right then, the green way of thinking, let's call it green ideology, now seems to be on the way to defining our lifestyles, the economy, and the whole of society and its functioning. It is remarkable, and it is something that I have tried to explain since I started writing on this subject in the 2000s, that green politics do not survive the ballot box. Yet the green agenda is the most encompassing ideological project the world has seen since the first half of the previous century. We know now that if you're in the UK, the net zero agenda is going to take away your gas boiler and very likely take away your car, unless you can afford an EV with sufficient range. We also know that the global green agenda is going to take $130 trillion from ordinary people's savings and pensions and through tax. What is less obvious is how changes are being made to society through the back door. And make no mistake, the green agenda is about transforming the whole of society, whether or not individuals, families, or communities want their lives to be changed. Nowhere do I find this more sinister than in attempts to use courts to bypass democratic decision-making. Litigation is the instrument of powerful and wealthy people and interests, and is beyond the means of ordinary people who have not been represented by politicians, political parties, NGOs, or so-called civil society in the UK. But this is how the green agenda has been advanced across the UK, Europe, and America. What happens if the dark green ideology of doom, epitomized by David Attenborough, the styled as the people's advocate, but who is against people? What happens if that is made, his ideas are made into legal principle? It's the untold story of climate change politics, I think, and I believe it is perhaps the biggest scandal, bigger than any claims that climate data or climate science has been faked. Our guest tonight is Chris Horner, and we're going to be talking about climate lawfare. If I can get Chris's books up. Yeah. Chris is the author of Red Hot Lies: How Global Warming Alarmists Use Threats, Fraud, and Deception to Keep You Misinformed. Power Grab: How Obama's Green Policies Will Steal Your Freedom and Bankrupt America. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming and Environmentalism. And The Liberal War on Transparency. Chris is also board member of Government Accountability and Oversight, whose Climate Litigation Watch project aims to uncover and reveal the extent of climate lawfare, the dodging of democracy. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Ben.
Well, your books pull no punches. That's clear. Would you like to tell us about a couple of them, maybe the two most recent, and your Government Accountability Project and Climate Litigation Watch?
Yeah, thanks. Well, my favorite's Red Hot Lies, which is timeless. Sometimes I'll post up images, chapters on how the poisoning the little ones keeps coming up. We saw this years before it really became obvious with the kids' marches. It was in the UK. Some very disturbing percentage of kids reported having difficulty to sleep at night. This was over a decade ago because of what was going on in the schools, what was being put into their heads in the schools about catastrophic man-made global warming. An incident in Australia, a particular individual was convinced he was participating in an ongoing ecological catastrophe, refused water, and so on. These are anecdotes, and obviously the plural is not data, but it was obvious 12 years ago what was going on, and we're seeing those fruits now. Went into the IPCC, had some great help in writing these and the Politically Incorrect Guide from real champions who had been participants in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and saw how it was being used and how it was being run and how the underlying work was to be harmonized with the summary for policymakers, somewhat upside down. And so they were leaving the process, but talking out about it. So we've known a lot about this, what's now an industry, for quite a long time. And there's still more to tell. And I've been watching your reports during this COP, and you're proving that. But in some ways, they're just repeating cycles, right? I thought Benny Peiser's interview with you just nailed it when he described how these COPs, they're cycles, and how the operatic conclusion is predictable because it's been scripted. And yeah, I imagine this year it'll be Saturday morning early when they emerge teary-eyed, bleary-eyed, waving a piece of paper declaring Greenpeace for our time and announcing a historic climate agreement to meet again next year. But as you've pointed out, it's getting very serious, the way they're leaning on financial institutions, and financial institutions are looking to be leaned on to institute this agenda that democracy keeps denying them.
Right. So is that part of your what you do with the Government Accountability Project and Climate Litigation Watch? Could you tell us about those?
Right. GAO was organized almost 4 years ago to take a look at how governmental institutions were being used, with whom, at whose direction. As we've come to find out, we had seen an awful lot of very unsettling developments in particularly the climate space. I had become particularly focused on this use of law enforcement in the United States to use the courts to go after opponents. Because as you've seen, the left is captured by this idea, by this obsession, that there can be no opposition to their demands that's grounded in good faith disagreement. It's dark forces, it's venality, we must get to the bottom of it. We'll start by pursuing those dark forces with law enforcement. So state attorneys general here in the United States were enlisted. There was a press conference, which you may remember. It was remarkable, and yet it was very little remarked upon at the time. There were, I forget the number, 19 attorneys general or 20 represented at an event, a press conference in Manhattan. Standing next to them was an investor. Right. And they were vowing to use the power of their office by whatever means necessary to go after the opponents of this investor. They didn't expressly say you didn't need to. You brought him up on the stage.
Right.
Al Gore, we're going to go after those. He's short, I suppose. And that was quite something. We'd not seen that. And then we saw the attorney general of the United States asked in a colloquy, in a hearing by a Judiciary Committee senator named Sheldon Whitehouse, have you at the Department of Justice or FBI looked into going after opponents of the climate agenda using the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act? And she said, yes, it's been discussed. Well, if anybody needed to see anything more to know, you need to start looking, using these public information laws that we have and you have, to find out how in the world did this come about?
This was the hint. This was hinted at, wasn't it? With famously with Roger Pilker Jr. Is that right? He was, and a couple of others. The Democrats towards the end of the Obama administration, I think. Did they were they threatening people on the outside of the consensus, well, broadly, not really outside the consensus position? They were threatening them with RICOs. Is that investigations? Is that right?
Right. It began actually with an ideological activist group we now know, the Rockefeller Family Fund, and they were recruiting attorneys general. actually began in 2008. There was a meeting in California, and there was discussion of finding a, quote, single sympathetic attorney general, because he or she would have subpoena power and could wrench documents out of private entities that could be useful to the climate tort industry, because they had decided, again, democracy had failed them. There was actually a quote by the gentleman who presented there, a tort lawyer named Matt Pawa. He was quoted in The Nation magazine saying, "I've been told that for years that legislation's coming. Legislation takes too long. Democracy doesn't give us everything we want as soon as we want, so we're going to sue." And thus was born this climate tort industry. But then, using a pincer movement, attorneys general joined. I don't know that it was Roger Pielke. Forgive me, Roger, if you were subpoenaed, but the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which I was with for 20 years, including at the time, was subpoenaed by one of these attorney generals from the Virgin Islands. He now works at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in criminal enforcement. Cue the Jaws theme. He subpoenaed 100 individuals or groups to get their records about why they were so uniquely effective in opposing something that people don't want, and that they couldn't, again, this movement couldn't make its case to the public. There must be dark forces behind it.
Well, should we come to
a terrible product?
Let's come back to the detail of all that later. So basically, you're one of the few people keeping an eye on the use of courts to try and advance the climate agenda. Is that right in the US? But this is a bigger. This isn't particular to the USA, is it? This is European and British and probably elsewhere. I think I've seen stuff in the Netherlands as well. Attempts to bring climate litigation. We'll come into that. You've mentioned that you pretty much agree with what Benny Pies was saying last week on the UNFCCC is a process rather than something with a single outcome. I think that's something that's coming across very strongly from everyone, is that there's a bit of a shrug about COP meetings in particular and the process in general. It's sort of is it a ratcheting? Is it an explosion? Are we going to? I mean, from a legal point of view, could there be a final deal and then nothing happened, or what would it create? Would it create an international bureaucracy, a global bureaucracy that countries are beholden to? I mean, it seems a bit mysterious to everyone. Are they going to be our new overlords? What can they really do? I think that's the question I'm really searching for.
It's sort of seat of the pants. We know they started with a plan. The first COP I attended was in The Hague 21 years ago, COP 6, at which Jacques Chirac gave his plenary talk about the Kyoto Treaty being the first component of an authentic global governance. And I was there on a press credential for UPI. And I sent that story in, and I was chastised by my editor saying, "You can't make things up. No one would ever say that." And I recall a Congressman, James Sensenbrenner, giving a press conference saying, "If you want to make something toxic," I'm capturing it, I don't recall his words, in the US, well, talk about it like that. And there was a reporter for The Guardian, I don't remember who he was, and he was circling, just circling, saying, "Bollocks, bollocks, bollocks." He couldn't stand soon-to-be Chairman Sensenbrenner was saying this to the press gaggle. But of course, that became an infamous quote here. And at the time, I did not realize I was watching the creation of essentially a self-perpetuating entity. You still have to plug it into the taxpayer funding, but it is this perpetual motion machine. Otherwise, it is. There's no end in sight. Ever closer union. Okay.
This is what. Yeah. Right. Yeah. This is what Rupert Darwell last week said. It was sort of given a push by Maurice Strong in 1970, whenever, and then snowballed ever since. It's just this sort of black hole into which everything else falls. But
right, it's the blob climate is the blob that's eaten environmentalism. Real, actual conservation has got to be sold as climate work. I remember I loved your interview with Martin Durkin, and his film, the great interview with, I'm forgetting his name now, but he said, if you want to get your grant to study the nut gathering habits of the brown Surrey squirrel or whatever it was, then put in the impact of climate change on the nut gathering habits of the brown Surrey squirrel, and you'll get your money. Well, all environmentalism is now climate, and that's a shame because there are actual environmental concerns. And Bjorn Lomborg makes the point. I'm with him most of the way on his argument that you're talking about, you are the opportunity cost here. You're killing a lot of people because you're wasting resources. Now, the answer, I disagree with Bjorn, isn't to just waste, therefore, 10% of it. It's how about let's focus and let's get serious about this. But this will go on, I assume, forever. And I imagine that's the intention. There is no, if you were to ask, I don't remember the year, it might have been 2001. I had a piece in National Review called Punxsutawney Protocol. Punxsutawney Phil is you know him. And I noticed that already by that point, the headlines hailed every November, December, a historic climate deal. And it was always, Paris was touted as the first step. And I thought, wow, this is strange. Can I have my money back if this is the first step? Because I don't think this is the first step. You keep using that phrase.
Groundhog Cop, yeah.
Each of these will be the first step, but they're each hailed as a historic climate pact. Okay, well, we know the labor leader in the U.S. who answered the question, well, when you get what you want, what do you want? He said more. Well, what is your end game here? That'd be a good question to get an answer to. It used to be answered in terms of degrees Celsius. Even that answer keeps changing. I assume it'll be 1 degree soon. 6-minute abs, 5-minute abs. There's no real end in sight. But again, the rational belief is this isn't about climate, right? It's about a lot of things, but it's a symphony of hysteria with many chairs. And you've got the Enrons who started this. We can talk about this, but I won't dwell on it. But the Enrons who created this industry, they're always going to be these folks until someone in industry like now Lord, I guess John Brown and Ken Lay decided to monetize their green credentials and buy things on the cheap. This wasn't really a viable industry, climate change. And then you've got folks who are just mere rent seekers, not really the drivers. And then you've got your basic bootlegger and Baptist coalition. There's a lot of folks, the NGO state complex. There are a lot of interests to keep this thing going. And it's up to individuals to notice these headlines that you see in the UK, you see them in Germany, about fuel poverty deaths, the most vulnerable. Why are they skyrocketing in very neat coincidence with this agenda-taking route? At some point, do we say maybe the issue isn't we didn't insulate enough? Maybe this coincidence is more than that? You're causing deaths, real deaths?
Speaking of Groundhog Day, your president, former president of the United States, now apparently president of all of the small island states in the world. Let's hear from him at COP while he. Pause. Go on, Barry. Okay. Meaningful pause. So that's an interesting point, isn't it? The state, the sort of fracturing of state versus country, federal level participation in global climate politics and global climate deals. There was a moment at which they discovered that they could bypass essentially the executive of any national government, and the same thing happened in Britain. I think they made a big effort to try and get mayors of big cities to sign up to global climate negotiations, which I think made those local authorities, those local governments, and those mayors feel very important indeed, especially here. But do you have any observations on that?
So I didn't have the audio, but I love the chyron for GBN there. Former U.S. The news item is Barack Obama gives a speech. But
sorry,
I do know about the subnational actor emphasis. That was a focus of a lot of freedom of information activity by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, NB. And it was a major push, particularly when President Trump was elected. It was, well, we need California and Washington State and Upper Iguana, and everybody needs to be represented here as essentially a national actor, bypassing not just the federal executive, but our own system, where states are purporting, as you know, to enter into international agreements on this front. But that was a project. There was the mayor's project of Mr. Bloomberg. The Hewlett Foundation was underwriting getting these governors involved, and it was to be everybody but the United States president, because he no longer mattered. Anything, again, the thesis here, this is a very anti-democratic project. And this is one of the key ways, and lawfare is another of the key ways, to get around the inability to make free societies do this to themselves, which generally they won't. Some will. You saw with your Climate Act, I forget, it was near unanimous. Some will rush into this because there is this awesome machine. And the political class and creatures don't really feel that they're between two forces here.
Yeah,
seniors who are being pressed by fuel poverty actually have a lobby equivalent to you can stand up XR and whatever else overnight.
Yeah. So briefly, apologies everyone. I didn't share the audio on that, so I've just corrected that. I won't play it again. Briefly, what Barack Obama was saying is that he was a little bit disappointed about Trump's election, and he made a lot of emphatic pauses, and he spoke about how states had made their own commitments and governors had made their own commitments. So what that really speaks to, I think, the fact of Brexit and Trump elections really sending a bit of a shockwave through the global political order, so to speak. It had to reassert itself somehow, and the next easiest route, rather than trying to persuade national democracies, was through local government. I don't know if you agree with that, but
right. Well, again, I read the Mail, and this was stood up by donors immediately. And there's a report at CEI.org where you can read Government for Rent, I believe, and it went into how 3 governors' staff, California, New York, and Washington State, got together and said it can't always be a staff doing the work of staff, and that they needed $50 million a year, private money, to provide outside staff for governors to push climate. That was just governors. And to say things like, we're still in. Well, you were never in. If you want to try to legally commit your state, that's fine. But it was a gesture. This is heavily larded with gesture politics, as you know, but they had to somehow keep momentum for 4 years, particularly after President Trump did the right thing, if in the worst possible way, when he withdrew from Paris.
That's right. That's the interesting thing, isn't it? He was acting on pretty much what he said he was going to do, what he told the American people that he was going to do, and that's upset Barack Obama. I mean, again, it's like what you were saying earlier. It's a good faith discussion. That, like, whether all of the febrile atmosphere of the election to one side, that's what he said he was going to do. That's but that doesn't seem to resonate with some people. So let's move on to the next story. Under 50, this is a survey from Britain. Under 50% of households are willing to pay thousands to make homes greener. Well, cough up, plebs, right? And it turns out there's this data, which are
What's stopping them?
right? Yeah, nothing. Or apparently, it's money.
Other people's money.
Other people's money. Apparently, people get a lot. People get a lot keener on the green agenda when they earn more than twice as much as the average salary. That's when you start seeing this sort of increase in support. But people are really starting to worry now about how they're going to do it. So there's this sort of discussion underneath the story, which is attached to a poll from a guy called. If we scroll down, it's a long article. Will Tanner of the think tank Onward, and sure enough, if you go and look at the think tank Onward, its principal funder is an organisation called the European Climate Foundation, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. Is also the funder of pretty much all of the organisations involved in climate lawfare in the UK. So, there's a little. A cheery little story, at least for today. So the next story I wanted to look at, make anything work in this studio. There we go. This is This is a climate change negotiator at the COP26, and he's going to tell us what it really means. What good he's doing for all of us. Do scream and shout if you can't hear it, and I'll just stop it.
There are a lot of myths told about the day of a negotiator, but the one thing that is true, it is hard. Imagine trying to bring together 197 friends and trying to get them to agree on where to go for lunch. Actually, you're trying to bring them together to try to agree decisions that will have fundamental impact. We are deciding the detailed rules, systems, mechanisms that will underpin the grand commitments that have been made. That's why we work through the night. That's why we focus on the detailed text. These words matter. These words will then be taken home by the countries that are here, and they will be taken into their parliaments and lead to legislation and policies. They will be taken away by businesses into their boardrooms to action that will actually fundamentally change people's lives.
Ooh, what do you reckon? Do you want your lives changed by that chap? He strikes me as exactly how I'd imagined a climate change negotiator, changing people's lives.
What I don't get, Ben, is I saw the headlines here for 4 years.
Yeah,
it was just the U.S. Everyone else agreed, but it's like 97% of scientists agree on. Okay, now, dear, can we just slow down and you tell me what it is they agree upon? What is it that the whole world but the United States agreed? The entire world agreed that the United States should do to itself things that most of the world was not willing to do to itself. That's pretty easy to get agreement on. I'm not sure what this gentleman's struggle is, what they have to stay up into the night about. I thought this was understood. So let me just say the reportage on this issue is about as bad as on any issue I can imagine. I recall back in the day, the New York Times flipped from saying, George W. Bush refused to sign the Kyoto Treaty. He also refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles and numerous treaties the United States didn't sign because someone beat him to it. Bill Clinton, actually, his acting UN ambassador, signed the Kyoto Treaty. But for years, our most esteemed media outlets said George Bush refused to sign something he could no more sign than he could the Treaty of Versailles. Then he withdrew from it. Fantastic. Show me that instrument. Spoiler alert, it doesn't exist. It was just sloppy journalism, and the particular New York Times reporter in question on this story kept saying, it's my editors. It's always the editors. But every year it's a historic pact. Every year, without thinking, they say it's a first step.
Right.
This isn't the most soberly or coherently covered issue. Let's just say that about as gently as we can. And that's important because you see this. What are these poor dears staying up throughout the night?
So what you're saying, sort of in a way, when the US presidents were more keen on COP processes, that sort of took away their whipping boy. So since Kyoto, the US was something of the sort of the great big evil, and in the background were emerging China and India as these huge economies. But now that's much harder to sustain, isn't it? That it was something like the Kyoto Protocol ultimately was intended to harm and punish America,
right?
And then oops! Now these emerging economies emit far more, are on a much more upward trajectory. They're not going to stop emitting. Oh, and then the emerging, the more developing economies, the much poorer economies, are now they want a bit of a taste too, right?
Now, do remember this. I forget if it was Annex 1, Annex 2, but this has been this elephant sitting in the room here is ever since Kyoto, it was the developing economies or lesser developed countries said, well, okay, you go first, and then we are certain to follow next time. And next time came, said, well, again, this is still your burden, historic, etc. Mumble, but we're surely going to go next. And now it's, I'll gladly pay you in 2060 for a hamburger today. You just have to continue all this self-harm. And it is a remarkable game they've played. At no point we clearly needed a bad guy, and on occasion the US electorate provides them one. What happens when the dog catches the car and they get a president who goes along with this and rejoins Paris and so on, which is very popular, but we won't submit it to Democratic approval in the Senate as it quite clearly requires. Well, why don't you turn to the people who for more than 2 decades have been saying, you go first and we're next step, we're right with you. It's always somewhere over the horizon. It's always 30 years away, like some other things in this issue.
Yeah. So the reality, the substance, I think, of the Negotiators, what he's really doing was given away also today in another news item. I think GB News has exaggerated the figure here. I think it's actually 260 million. Now, as far as I'm aware, there are more than 3 times 300 million people who don't even have access to electricity. I think we've discussed that on the live streams previously, but the UK government has announced plans to invest almost 300 million helping the most vulnerable countries fight the impact of climate change. Well, that's going to be like $1 a person, right? That's not going to help much. Is that anything more than a slush fund? I can't help wondering.
I don't think so. This has been a complaint of what I'll say ours. I worked with some very talented people at CEI, Marlo Lewis and Myrony Bell, for 20 years on this, and they would very keenly point out that you're talking about just this is wealth transfers to often kleptocrats who to keep their countries poor. You're paying countries not to develop. The key, obviously, and this burns the ears of many, but wealthier's healthier, wealthier's cleaner, wealthier's greener, wealthier's more resilient. The one thing you don't want to do is put your boot on that which drives wealth creation. I mean, I have children, and they've come home from school saying things from the back seat where I had to pull over and say, look around, we live. Have they told you about Detroit yet in school? Look around where we live. Very wealthy part of the world. And it is not, you remember Maurice Strong? You mentioned him. I testified next to him at a Senate hearing once. He was infamous for saying that wealth isn't the cure, it's the disease. That's what's driving this.
Wow. Our wealth is a disease, not his wealth, right? He was fabulous.
Yeah, not many poor people say this, but an awful lot of rich people. This is a wealthy white Western movement. As you know, there's a tremendous amount of resources being dedicated to try to rebrand this, put a different face on the movement, but it is what it is. And if you truly wanted to have more Florida and less Bangladesh, which I don't believe they do, where would any of these people rather be when that same storm hits? Florida. Why? Well, all of the answers as to why. Infrastructure, institutions, it all comes from wealth, which all derives from affordable, abundant, reliable energy. And what does this target? This targets that which provides, when the same storm hits, more Florida and less Bangladesh. Again, it's not rationally about climate. It's about what people who got it rolling, like Maurice Strong said. It's about, I'm aboard, pull up the ladder, in short.
On the subject of Bangladesh and versus Florida, this is the we'll come on to climate lawfare proper in a moment, but here's a very interesting thing I saw today.
Adaptation, Loss and Damage COP26 Day 8. 1 billion children are at extremely high risk from climate change. Drought, fires, floods and storms are increasing. Communities everywhere must adapt to climate impacts. We must scale up on action, loss and damage due to climate change. Let's support vulnerable communities to build resilience.
Yeah, so just go their claim there, floods and storms and fires. Roger Pilker Jr. has the facts as ever on that claim. If I can find them there. From the most recent IPCC report. I'll just show you how to understand these claims. Flooding, no detection, no attribution. Drought, no meteorological drought, no hydrological drought detected or attributed to climate change. Ecological drought and agricultural drought, I'm not entirely sure what they are, but go and have a look if you're minded. Or fire weather, possibly, but as he goes on to point out, actually the evidence, there's much less evidence in and confidence in these claims than that might indicate, which is surprising given that video was produced by the UN, by the COP26 authorities, whoever they are. I presume that's sort of a mixture of the UN and the UK government. But that's just routine, isn't it, Chris? That's just making stuff up.
Right.
If we were there and we were saying people are doing all right, and we'd rather everyone in Bangladesh was as wealthy as everyone in Florida, right? And then no one would be damaged by extreme weather. We'd be thrown out as deniers or something, wouldn't we?
Right, it's heresy. So it's quite something how you can get away. Carbon dioxide is now carbon dioxide. It used to be plant food. We all grew up with it, and you've seen how quickly you can demonize. Seen the Penn and Teller petition drive, where to get signatories to ban dihydrogen monoxide, the industrial effluent associated with corrosion and even death, water. You can demonize things, and you can create a new conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom, we seem to have forgotten that climate, more appropriately weather, always unpredictable, often severe weather, has always historically been among the greatest challenges. And the wealthiest societies adapted best. The societies that burned witches adapted very poorly. But here we go again. And it isn't necessarily climate, of course. How can Singapore and Iceland be two of the richest societies in the world? It's wealthier is healthier, wealthier is cleaner, greener, more resilient. But you're onto something with the lawfare. This attribution is a problem for the climate litigation industry. And I'll tell you some things we found. You remember back during that climate RICO spell we were talking about. This was the spring of 2016 when the New York Attorney General gathered all sorts of like-mindeds and an investor named Al Gore and stood on the stage and threatened to sue people if they didn't give him what he wanted. The Washington State Attorney General, we had their correspondence. It's a funny story how we got it. They hid it off from us and rolled a black paint roller over it. But another department, the Department of Biology, was more compliant with the law, and they released the records because they're not privileged. And it showed email discussions about, why didn't we sue again when New York asked us to? And the Attorney General said, well, attribution. We couldn't attribute. We want to say 5% of that storm was caused by BP. And
we'll come back to science later on. But could you how did you start? What was your first sort of discovery, as it were, in that something was amiss in this political tendency, the direction things were going in?
In my case, it was my introduction. I had left my law firm in Washington to be director of federal government relations for an energy company. Not really many interviews. It was a job offer, and it was described as an excellent opportunity for me. It was everyone's favorite energy company. Our office was right there, catty corner to the White House. The governor of Texas had a nickname, George W. Bush at the time, for the CEO, called him Kenny Boy, and the company was Enron. I had no idea. I didn't even understand rent-seeking or Baptist and bootlegger coalitions, to be honest with you. I was just innocently practicing law in D.C. And very soon after, extremely soon after joining Enron in a non-attorney capacity, so I can talk about it, I found myself in a room with BP representatives and various other industry reps and all of the green groups around a big conference table of a fancy New York law firm. And we were all trying to figure out how to get a global warming treaty, even though this was very unpopular in the US. In fact, several weeks later, the Senate unanimously said, don't go to Kyoto and do this.
So this would be like in 97 Kyoto
97.
Protocol time. Yeah.
And not much more than a week. A week after the Senate unanimously, again, let that sink in, the unanimous United States Senate, having not been asked for what we call advice and consent under our Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Senate shall give its advice and consent before entering anything like that. Having noticed that Bill Clinton wasn't going to ask for their advice, they told him in advance. It was remarkable.
So you're saying both Democrats and Republican sides of the House,
John Kerry, yeah, I think Joe Biden, he was certainly in the Senate.
Right. They told Bill Clinton, you're not going to sign this.
Don't go there and agree to this or anything that looks like it. And they sketched it out. And they sketched out what you're still seeing today. And then Ken Lay and John Brown had an Oval Office meeting with Bill and Al. And that shows you some pretty heavy swat. I think August 4th, 1997. And they said, go ahead. And the rest is history. If misreported by the New York Times, we did sign it. We did agree to it. We did sign it. We never unsigned it. But anyway, it's a dead letter now. But that was, I popped off about when did we go from asking if this was a problem to how to make a buck off it. And that went over like a lead balloon. And so
you asked your colleagues in Enron.
Yes, that wasn't appreciated. And there was another voice there who wrote great memos. And by the way, this is something that Climate Litigation Watch has covered recently. Rob Bradley was Ken Lay's personal economist, and he was tasked with going out and assessing this. And he said some very interesting things, and there were some pretty bitter internal fights about Enron being so publicly. Should they be so publicly? Should they jump in front of this parade? Or actually, they were investing in it to make it happen. They just bought the world's largest windmill company on the cheap, obviously, though that's not economic at the time. And Ken Lay was going to set about making sure that the taxpayer generated rents for these uneconomic machines he was manufacturing. And then he had the world's second biggest gas pipeline outside of Gazprom. And I mean, it was going to be, they could throw their coal trading business overside. And soon enough, that led me to becoming a climate and a transparency guy. I began to send FOIA requests trying to figure out how is government used this way. I was shocked, truly. And
so Enron, I mean, this is when Enron was seeking to take advantage of these, the potential of global climate negotiations, cap and trade, and they were trying to situate themselves as the market leader in buying, selling, trading emissions permits. Is that right? Right.
They had set up, they were working with Goldman Sachs to have a trading floor for selling these ration coupons. They were way ahead of the game. And in fact, I suspect that went into some of their investments because, again, you can buy things that are not economic on the cheap. And then if you go about setting value to them through favors from friends in government. So Enron was sort of the inventor of the climate industry. Remember, this is 1997. This really was still global warming. It was still pretty fringe. Teresa Heinz Kerry was writing Ken Lay about what a climate hero he was. And BP became beyond petroleum for a while. I heard about a month ago, they announced they're not really beyond petroleum. Enron, there were some rent seekers making sure that this took off. And it did take off. But the other key thing, not only was Rob Bradley discussing in his assessments to Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling and others in these memos, which you can find at climatelitigation.com, sorry. He was explaining the scientific debate and the weaknesses and what he was encountering. And then he said, look, I understand we're trying to make money off this. In fact, one of the emails to him telling him to cut it out said, subject line, help me make Enron rich. And he wrote an email to Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling saying, we may get our short term, or whatever he said, Enron may get its micro get here, but it's quite possible we will suffer from the macro harm that comes from politicizing international energy markets. Well, I don't subscribe to many newspapers, but the ones I've seen in the past few months show that these are being visited upon us. The perils of politicizing international energy markets are most definitely coming home to roost.
So if you had really good foresight, you could pretty much see how things were going to unfold from 1997. What one could, if you and that it's pretty much along the lines that Gore and his cronies and Kerry wanted it, rather than, I mean, maybe a lot slower, right. but so you quit there, and so we're going to cut a bit of a long story short. Could you just give a sort of a nutshell account of what climate lawfare is and how it's toxic to democracy?
Let me say, quit is a charitable term. I was no longer welcome in that establishment, let me just say. And I may have regaled you of the things that began. It was unpleasant. So lawfare, and I pulled up the original quote because it was a quote tossed out by a U.S. military official some years ago as the use of law as a weapon of war strategically to handcuff the United States in an effort to exploit our values to defeat us. So we take a little bit of liberty from its organic usage, lawfare. Lawfare is what's going on. They are using our values and our institutions, but politicians' words against us to get what democracy's denied them. So it's a twist. And let me say real quickly what it is, what we're facing here. They're using litigation, the climate industry, with this vexatious multi-front litigation campaign, just 1,000 cuts to get, because they're sure industry's by. It's not that the public don't want this. This is really industry opposition. It doesn't seem to be industry opposition. Industry, as I was noting, is largely on board, so long as they.
So you're saying even fossil fuel interests are quite happy with the direction of policy, essentially, is what you're saying. This idea of deniers with fossil fuels on one side and the science and all the good people of the UN on the other, it's not quite the picture. Is that right?
I don't think the climate industry quite gets it, which is they're just sure that industry is their natural enemy, and it doesn't seem to be the case. Again, it wasn't just BP and Enron, and I could tell you some others in the room, but it was this utility, this trade association, that. Now it's the folks have positioned themselves as if this really is inevitable. You know how inevitable things end politically, but this really is supposedly inevitable, from ESG and the climate risk disclosure campaign, such that, well, you're going to have to restate all of your projections and your claims of asset values, because in the inevitably carbon constrained world, you've been misstating them. They're really zero, and so on.
Right.
But Wall Street's captured as, institutionally, with rare exceptions. Academia is captured institutionally. There's a tremendous amount. Folks, who really are the opponents? The opponents are the public, who have always been, this obviously doesn't poll well. It does great with industry.
So the defendants of climate lawfare are typically either energy companies and or governments, or even departments of governments that,
So lawsuits will be against private parties and government to force them to act or to cease to act. Against private parties, they're seeking three things, and this is what led to the opposition. Naturally, it was overreach. The demand was, there were three demands at first when this began. Stop supporting people we don't like CEI and others.
Yeah.
Check, done, got it. Next, support this agenda. Well, so long as we can design it. Carbon tax, cap and trade, designed by industry. The LA Times reported it when it passed. Industry designed this. So long as we can design it, check. Next, hundreds of billions of dollars, which of course is paid by employees, shareholders, and consumers in the end. But fortunately, industry balked at that, seems to be, because they're fighting the lawsuits that are against industry. Not all these lawfare suits are against industry. So that was the good news. The overreach was just too much. It is literally hundreds of billions of dollars, because they're starting with the tobacco settlement in the US, which was $200 billion in 1996 dollars, I think. So you're talking about a lot of money. And by the way, hydrocarbon energy plays a much bigger role in the economy than tobacco. So this is a spectacular sum. Okay. But what we've obtained in open records litigation are confessions that this is to be a sustainable funding stream. Now, let's think about that for a second. This is a quote. It was from a state cabinet official from a state in the Northeast, Rhode Island, who was at a gathering at the Rockefeller Family Mansion of 13 states with the Rockefeller Family Fund. They were discussing what they discussed at these meetings. How do we get this done? And a Rhode Island cabinet official said, we're suing big oil in state court to obtain a sustainable funding stream. Sustainable. You don't mean in the colloquial sense. You mean that this goose is going to keep on giving. How is that exactly? I thought you said they're killing the planet and must be stopped. Well, maybe that was a little strong. We have to haggle. A sustainable funding stream. And some other documents, last thing we got from an attorney general's Gmail account. They're turning to Gmails to avoid open records laws. That doesn't avoid open records laws. It just sometimes avoids scrutiny. The recruiter for the Rockefeller Family Fund, called Center for Climate Integrity, said, if you're searching for new streams of revenue, you should join these lawsuits that we're recruiting plaintiffs around the country. New streams of revenue, and then another one said sustainable funding stream. And by the way, we had it not only in handwritten notes, but Tom Steyer had a representative at the meeting, and she typed up her notes, and she used the exact same phrase. So this really is their intention, is to use lawfare to impose an agenda that democracy has denied them, because part of the deal is you have to lobby you have to stop your opposition, and you actually have to. What happens if you think about tobacco real quickly? You transfer a huge amount of money to be distributed by politicians to constituencies. You're underwriting, you're selling them the rope. You're giving them the rope. So that's the other, of course, is, as you referenced, the Netherlands type litigation, the Heathrow litigation to stop runways, to compel you to comply. And the Netherlands or Agenda Foundation ruling was, just because these agreements are non-binding doesn't mean you don't have to do it.
So who brings the cases? On whose behalf? That's always something that I find quite remarkable about these lawfare suits. Who are is it the plaintiffs? Is that the word?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it began with municipalities. Attorneys general would start investigations to help the plaintiffs bar. That was the goal. We'll get documents and give them to you. And the plaintiffs were municipalities: San Francisco, Oakland, New York City, college towns, and then some states like Rhode Island looking for sustainable revenue, sustainable funding streams. The notes actually said, because the legislature won't fund these governmental ambitions we have, so we have to scoop people to get a backdoor tax increase. And there's one private group of fishermen, same lawyers, but there's a private group of fishermen saying you've ruined our industry, so you have to pay too. So it's municipalities for the most part, some states, and one private entity. That's in the litigation seeking. It began as nuisance, and after being dealt a defeat in several defeats in federal court, they rebranded it as consumer fraud you told me I was putting a tiger in my tank, not catastrophic man-made global warming in my tank. Now you must pay. And the remedy is the same, by the way. They want the money, disgorgement of profits and gains to be distributed.
Right. So I've seen the one in the Netherlands was bought on behalf of a bunch of kids. I've seen that quite frequently as well. Is that seems to be, is that just performative? Is it because it looks much more friendly for cameras if you can get a bunch of 12-year-olds to sort of look sad and with pictures of polar bears and then say these kids' futures have been destroyed, so this evil company should be found guilty? Is that?
That's a big part of it. It's jurisdictional. There are differences in what can succeed in France because of a constitutional, something fashionable or something easily distorted or some guarantee. In a newer constitution, let's say than ours, where we don't have any guarantee, you have to sort of have the courts conjure it. But I believe Urgenda was brought on behalf of the children, but I could be mistaken. We have had that. Mm-hmm. We've had that here. It was the Climate Kids case. It's called Juliana versus the United States. And they got these adorable imps, a 60 minutes piece. And they made very telegenic plaintiffs, but legally very poor plaintiffs. And in the Ninth Circuit, which is, I suppose, infamous enough to be known about over there, is most often overturned by the Supreme Court. They lost. Unfortunately, the district judge to whom it was sent back recently said, you two go into a room and work this out. And one of the parties is now the Biden administration. So, yeah, I rather tremble for the outcome there. But that was, you can view that as performative because it wasn't a very good legal claim. But let me tell you this, the 2008 meeting in La Jolla, California that I mentioned earlier, where the activists, the tort lawyers, and it turns out a senior official from Attorney General Kamala Harris's office got together in La Jolla in 2008 to recruit AGs and figure out how to do an end run around Democratic failure. The slideshow of a University of Oregon professor we've obtained under their open records law, and she signaled Greta was coming. And she said this litigation will be surrounded by children's marches and protests. This is 2008. Children's strikes and marches, and sort of foretold. This was early.
The plot line for Greta had already been established. Yeah. When Greta was what 4 or something, and just waiting for casting to give them a call back and say we found her. Right. Yeah. That's look. We're running out of time. Can you go on a bit longer? Because is that okay?
Sure.
Have you got to go? Because I'm afraid I spent too much time talking about the nonsense coming out of COP, which we should have just ignored, really. So speaking of COP again, but the process can that create the basis for lawfare, right? So an agreement. We see a lot here about the Paris Agreement. The lawfare cases here there have been a couple of airport expansions, I believe, and even a road or a bridge or a tunnel under the Thames, which is badly needed. I mean, it's only over there. I can see it, and it takes you pretty much. Sometimes you have to drive into London to get out of London on the other side of the estuary, which is just a ridiculous journey. Anyway, anything can be shut down on the basis of it being incompatible with Paris, but Paris Agreement isn't part of the British statute, right? What's going on there? If you sort of mean, can you an FCC process really do that?
So you are hoping for the judge or the panel to get up on the right side of the bed that day, and again, depending on the jurisdiction, that would not float here, but already there have been friend of the court's briefs filed by academics saying, well, we did agree to Paris. And, the argument has long been, I wrote a paper about this in 2001 or 2 for the Federalist Society, be careful about running around thinking that, oh, I'm killing the planet and I just feel so bad, is really cheap virtue. It's going to be very expensive virtue. This will prove to be held against you. which is what the Agenda Court said. You can't continually say, boy, I made a mess of this place, and I cannot tell you how badly I feel. And I promise to get around to it soon over the horizon. You can't keep saying that for decades, which is what political creatures do, and not think this will, and not have other parties rely upon your assertions. That's sort of customary international law here. Well, we signed the law of the sea treaty, but we never ratified it. And the California court said, well, but you never unsigned it either. So now that's not actually how our founding document foresaw things happening. You can sign it, but we have another process. There are 2 of the 3 branches of government involved before the third comes in to decide who wins. That likely won't succeed here, but it is the idea in the Argenda case, for example. Well, you've been saying this for decades. I think they have a right to take you at your word. That's maybe grossly, but oversimplified. And I believe that was the Heathrow opinion. I remember the trial court. It said this is inconsistent with Paris and the UK Climate Change Act. And I don't know, I don't recall the final opinion on appeal. I think it was actually reversed, but the first 2 courts, if I'm not mistaken, said it's inconsistent with both. And you can say, well, the Paris is a throw-in, right? The key is the statute, but we're going to say and Paris. Well, that's a dangerous claim. We have found the Attorney General of Massachusetts wrote a letter to a group created by Michael Bloomberg to hire private activist attorneys and put them in the Attorney General offices to pursue this agenda.
Right.
In her letter to Bloomberg, asking for these privately hired lawyers to work be seconded to the AG's office and exercise the authority of the law enforcement in pursuit of Mr. Bloomberg's agenda, she actually said, and she got 2 of them, I need to put them to work enforcing the commitments made last year in Paris. That's stunning here. Absolutely stunning here.
So just to rewind a little bit, you're saying that billionaire news media mogul Mike Bloomberg put staff in AG offices around the country in different states to help push the climate agenda that he's financing and presumably interested in, and so on and so forth.
Very interested in, yes. And several attorneys general who wanted these resources, and by the way, full-time dedicated public affairs staff to promote, I say the Attorney General, not the Office of the Attorney General, which is a public corruption issue here. AG stands for aspiring governor in the United States. If you take Mr. Bloomberg's lawyers to do the things, tell us what they'll do, make sure it's consistent with what we like, and then we'll have full-time public affairs staff to promote just how great you are. That is, it certainly was. It may be a little murkier now that the Supreme Court has spoken on an issue, but that was a genuine public corruption concern. It certainly appears odious. If you're not convinced, let me just do a counterfactual and we can put any debate to rest. The National Rifle Association wants to place special assistant attorneys general, as does the Koch Foundation, by the way, and the Right to Life Foundation. They all would like to place special assistant attorneys general in the Texas and Florida AG offices to investigate abortion providers. You still okay with it? Why not? What changed? Bad people? That's not a distinction. So we know this is seedy because all you have to do is reverse the parties. But that's precisely what went on. 10 attorneys general have these lawyers. Some of them Maryland has 3 Bloomberg hired lawyers. We even have an email from one of them saying, hey, I'd like to switch positions. Can you describe what that position would be if I were the energy versus the environment special assistant AG? The email wasn't to the AG's office. The email was to Bloomberg's group.
Right. So you're saying that's in 10 different states this happened? Or this
it was 11 total, but yes, 10 right now.
Right. That you know of.
That we know of.
Right.
Correct. That they acknowledge. They used to acknowledge it. Then it turned out not everybody was keen on this idea. The counterfactual makes it pretty clear. And so they stopped telling you where these mercenaries were. And then under pressure, they did post it. The people running it are now in the Biden administration. So I'm not sure what its fate holds. It's sort of mission accomplished. Because
So
the idea was to pressure the federal government.
I've seen that a little bit here. You might get someone, a council office may have a few staff placed by the Green Blob, but there wouldn't be. That's not as significant as legal assistance in an AG's office, is it? That's more significant because they're deciding what cases to prosecute, and on is that right?
They have a say in it. We know why they were getting. Again, the easiest test is we can say, well, it's merely an executive function. For example, the Hewlett Foundation is placing these people in governor's offices. Hewlett, the European Climate Foundation, who you mentioned, that's a Hewlett recipient.
Yeah.
The Rockefellers placed staff in mayor's offices. And you can say, well, that's just executive, it's not law enforcement. But for example, these staff were placed and they would go to these meetings, and it was uncanny how these staff all came back and reported, it's my recommendation that we join this 100 mayors organization for staying in Paris or whatever. So it's still staff, but it's obviously more disturbing when they do when they've got a badge, for heaven's sakes. And because we know they're called pro bono. They make six figures and they get a 5% annual raise. That's the best kind of pro bono. I'm not sure that word means what they think it means, but if their benefits, their salaries, their raises are all being paid by someone on the outside who's watching their performance, not the attorney general, you can say, as they have to numerous courts that we have brought these cases before, we should see all of these records. This is a very curious use of the law enforcement capacity. And they've said, look, these lawyers all have a duty of loyalty to the attorney general. It's in the contract.
So I mean, just briefly, does this smacks of corruption and you say seediness, but it hasn't caused the outrage or the scandal? Is that because the media is not attuned to it? Is it too complicated for people who aren't familiar with the law to?
We have a strange phenomenon. I'm not sure which it is. It may be a combination of both, but there's this attitude that, well, climate and, well, Bloomberg, they got to pass. And so if you want to put an end to this, and I certainly do, we just need Texas or Florida to ask for the Koch Foundation to set up shop in their office. So our slumbering constitutional watchdogs and journalists can wake up to the ugliness of this arrangement. I will tell you this, in Virginia, where I am, the legislature put in a rider, a spending prohibition, because the attorney general here sought to get a Bloomberg lawyer or lawyers. And his application was truly remarkable. It said, to advance the agenda of your group. This would help us better advance the agenda of your group. Wow. So the legislature here banned it. And then we had a blue wave 2 years ago. You heard about the election 1 week ago. Virginia has off-year elections. 2 years ago, there was a blue wave, and the Democratic legislature kept that spending prohibition. Nobody wanted to publicly come out and defend this. The sorry fact, in answer to your question, is nobody's really been forced to come out and defend this. And I assure you, if the parties were reversed, as I've beaten that dead horse, they would have to defend it. So I think some chemical company or oil company ought to place a special assistant AG, and we can finally decide, oh, you know what, on second thought, maybe this isn't a good practice.
So at some point, there is going to be the denouement, essentially. There's going to be the test to decide the future in a way. Imagine
if this is the precedent going forward. So it would be nice. I know some Republican attorneys general did raise a similar point. They said, in response to the RICO investigations, we could just as easily investigate the claims of renewable energy companies. So you sure you want to go down that road?
Right.
I haven't seen anyone step up and say, I tell you what, I accept these terms, and I will bring on a Right to Life, a Koch Foundation, and an oil industry special assistant AG. Glad we had this discussion, but I just don't see it happening.
So on the sort of parallel to law is in a way science, isn't it? In these times, and here's an article in Nature magazine where British meteorologist from the Met Office, Richard Betts, claims that specific floods, heat waves, and more can be attributed to our actions, as it says there. So one of the claims he makes, at the end of his article, if I can find it, yes, although the courts, not climate scientists, make judgments on these matters, the legal process needs to be informed by objective, authoritative scientific evidence. So he's talking very much about using scientific authority in law. Have you seen much of that? I mean, I know we've chatted about it, but I have a couple of videos that people may want to watch, not live streams. The method that Richard Betts champions is basically comparing two computer simulations of the climate, one with today's level of CO2 and one with pre-industrial levels of CO2, and then they look for the signatures of an event such as a recent storm that maybe claimed some people's lives, and then by comparing them, you can say this type of storm happens twice as often in our world rather than the world with pre-industrial levels of CO2. Therefore, this energy company or this greenhouse gas emitter is 50% liable for this thing. This is well, it's just crazy, isn't it? But you must have seen a fair amount of it.
So there's a true method to this. I mentioned attribution and the Washington AG saying, well, the reason we didn't sue in 2016 was we couldn't attribute. Well, there's a tort firm that's cornered this market named Sher Edlin. They've got most of the plaintiffs. The gentleman who invented the industry sort of has lost most of his clients, including to this firm. Vic Sher is a Green Group lawyer, now has this firm. And he gave a talk at UCLA Law School. And he couldn't restrain himself, and he boasted that attribution, well, I needed to do this. So what I did is, remember, attribution was a problem. There were some people weren't becoming plaintiffs, clients. And he says, so I contacted this guy, Richard Heady, and I said, here's what I need. And then Heady produced the new attribution science. And attribution is now a very, very big deal. It was a topic of discussion. I just pulled this up by chance. I see slides from that 2008 La Jolla meeting from an Oxford gentleman, Miles Allen. They have brought on someone else, Frederica Otto. Attribution is the key. And this lawyer is boasting, well, we couldn't do it, so I asked this guy to do it. And so the science was made to order, it seems. Now, you can watch the speech at UCLA Law School and determine for yourself. But something we just found this spring. In the United States, a judge in California asked the plaintiffs and the defendant oil companies, give me a day-long tutorial on climate science. I know you remember this because it set, the climate industry couldn't believe it, but there is no discussion. Didn't I mention these are bad people? And Judge William Alsop took a full day tutorial, and he heard from climate scientists, and he ruled against the plaintiffs. Now, he didn't rule against them on the science. He didn't rule on the science, but it was a wake-up call. And I refer you to two posts at Climate Litigation Watch. Prepare the judges lest ye be judged, and prepare to be judged. They're recent. They show you the documents. What's happened is, after that 2018 opinion, the Environmental Law Institute, who had on its board and governing board a lawyer who consults for that law firm, set about to arrange judicial briefings because it looked like, oh my gosh, these judges might not only keep the case, they're trying to get this tried in state courts, whether it's home cooking or sustainable funding concerns, whatever, but they know that when they go to federal court, they lose. They might not only keep the case, but they might hear the science. And immediately thereafter was born a series of briefings for federal judges. And you'll never, I'm as surprised as you are who the briefers are. They're the plaintiff's witnesses. And the judges are getting one side because there is only one side. And it's coming in under they're sailing in under the flag of a creature of Congress called the Federal Judicial Center. It's got establishment imprimatur. National Academy of Sciences gets involved, and they've got a series of workshops. And they began from no climate workshops, briefings for federal judges, to suddenly it was 4 out of 6 that year, I think, 4 out of 7. The only one this year, I believe. It was generally 1 or 2 presentations a year on antitrust. And suddenly it became all about briefing judges on climate science and not actually having if then or discussion of the assumptions, which obviously are key to models. It's plaintiff's witnesses or amicus brief filers in these cases. It's the plaintiff's side exclusively briefing federal judges. Well, that goes to the article you were showing. We need to get this before judges, and judges need to adopt this. Well, I suggest that this is evidence that the climate litigation industry is very deliberately preparing for that.
Right. So there's this huge weight of cash and well-connected staffers within government, and similarly, if unorthodox or inconvenient scientific opinion has been slowly pushed out of scientific institutions over the last 2 or 3 decades as well. Like there's essentially a campaign of harassment against anyone who would disagree, and also the creation of new research organizations, which is research institutions. So the standards of the science are sort of also diminishing as the legal precedents are sort of changing, and that seems all quite dark, doesn't it? I have just a quick clip here, not a clip, a cutting. Client Earth, which is pretty much the major sort of environmental legal charity in Britain, often takes the government to court. But there's this weird thing on the Charities Commission website where it turns out they've received over 4 million quid from the government in recent years. I mean, I don't want to dwell on it too much, Chris, but why do governments fund people to take them to court? That's weird, isn't it?
Well, something I said earlier informs my answer to this, and that is it's in the governing class's interest to expand to this ever closer union, right? This ever more expanding blob of climate litigation and climate regulation, the supranational orchestration, whatever, state, federal. I mean, it creates jobs, to put it one way. This is very good for government. It's very good for academia. It's very good for science as it's recast itself as an authority, not a process. So it's a negotiating table. We see this here. Let me just say this. Like I mentioned in the Ninth Circuit, the federal judges said, why don't you two go in a room and work this out? Except one side of the table is not the Trump administration DOJ anymore. It's the Biden administration DOJ. And I don't know how closely you follow the school scandals here, but we now know that DOJ is very easily politicized if anybody wasn't convinced by what happened in 2016. So it's a negotiating table with really one side. They're negotiating with themselves. We call it sue and settle here, sweetheart suits. It's actually what's going on right now.
And that risks creating a precedent for further action. Is that right? That's one of the great dangers here. That once you start to once a precedent is set in law, then that sets the basis for a whole load more cases. Is that right?
So I'll tell you, the Wall Street Journal had a great editorial March, I think 18th of this year, and it was called Biden's Backdoor Climate Plan. And it told a story just about this. A lawsuit was filed by progressive attorneys general the day before Joe Biden's inauguration. I forget the number of them, let's say 19. And it was, therefore, it made sure that only the Biden administration could answer the lawsuit. And the Biden administration, after taking its time, more in sorrow than anger, has decided, you know what, I think they're right. I do need to revisit these rules. That meat man who came before me was wrong. And under our system, subsequent agencies are allowed to revisit prior positions. But this was just so obviously a sue and settle. Why obviously? Not just the clumsy optics. We have the emails. We have numerous attorneys general telling courts, oh, they can't see the rest because we're about to file. It's a sue and settle.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is the appearance of adversarial process. It's all there is. It's a sweetheart deal to impose something. Again, Congress has never passed the climate law they want here. So the lawfare industry is seeking to recast existing law to, you know what, it really says the following. President Obama tried that. It was put on hold by the Supreme Court. President Trump put an end to that. Anyway, President Biden now wants to do that. And now they're going to recast the law with the agency agreeing with them. You know what? They're right. And under our system, there's this deference. Well, they're the experts. They're not political hacks. They're the experts. Therefore, I'm going to give them deference. And so if the Biden administration thinks that's how this law reads, well, under our deference doctrine, that may be how the law reads.
So one quick question before the final question, if I may, and it's related to Chris. So Stu Green is asking, is this like in Enron conspiracy with green hedge funds funding legal action? I was going to ask something similar, which is who? I mean, in general, who is behind? We've mentioned Bloomberg, but I think it's bigger than just one guy or the Hewlett Fund, and I don't think people. I find it difficult to convey the scale of the green blob in when I write, because it's just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you've got Jeff Bezos dropping back down to earth a week or so ago, and his Christian indulgence for his sins is a $10 billion bung to the green movement, right? So could you sum that up for us if you can? I've just got one more question when that's
okay.
When that's fine. So I'll let you go soon. Sorry.
So we have. Well, I'm enjoying it. So we contingency fee litigation is something that took a long time to accept here, but in order to provide increased access to justice, lawyers can file suit for you and take a third, let's say, some reasonable percentage, something not taking the whole get. It's typically a third, or in these massive lawsuits, let's say it'll be 20% of the first 100 million, something along those lines, 50 in a graduated scale down. And the idea was there are illiquid plaintiffs, and this will and the law firms take risk in taking on the case. So these lawsuits are being brought on a contingency fee basis. Oh, so the firms are undertaking risk. It doesn't seem so. There's a charitable foundation that has been giving the lead law firm in this grants of, I'm forgetting the amounts. You can find them at Climate Litigation Watch. Let's say a couple $1 million. Charitable grants to a tort law firm. And a law professor had a nice article in Forbes saying this looks pretty bad. It shows they're not the firm, if this is what's going on. And the firm says, no, it's unrelated. That was for environment work and this is climate, or something along those lines. You can read their charitable filings. Then the risk that justifies these contingency fee agreements is really not there. And the plaintiffs aren't the illiquid type that this modification of the ethics laws contemplated. It's San Francisco, it's Oakland, it's Boulder, Colorado, it's New York City. Okay, so yes, a lot of mismanaged places that are seeking sustainable funding streams. I understand that, without taking the political hit for the tax increase. But it does seem to be that this is not as it first appeared. These aren't just taking a flyer, this won't cost us anything. It won't, the states, we don't have loser pays like you do. It's a different system. We've got these mass torts because as long as somebody's underwriting the litigation, and let me make one more point about that, if I may, then there's a lot less risk to go along. There's a lot less disincentive to file. We found something recently in open records litigation. So I was working for a group that sued the Vermont and many other attorneys general after that RICO press conference with Al Gore. And there was one document they really didn't want to let go of until a court ordered them to 18 months later. And it was an agenda for something that an email called the secret meeting at Harvard, as if I wasn't already interested. And the Harvard agenda was called Potential State Causes of Action Against Major Carbon Producers. And it was co-chaired by my favorite professor from law school, true story, and Union of Concerned Scientists. And it brought in tobacco lawyers and activists and staff from a bunch of attorneys general, some potential municipal plaintiffs. And then an email said, it's for AGs, scientists, and prospective funders. Obviously, I was puzzled by this. It's the state bringing the lawsuit. Who could possibly be funding that? What do you mean by that? I'm completely at a loss. Well, now I think I know. What's going on is there's a PR campaign that needs to be mounted in support of these heroic champions of the future. And there are boiler room operations that need to be provided to support the legal team. And these boiler rooms have been stood up at law schools. Harvard, Yale, University of Chicago, UCLA Law School, public universities, so we can get a little bit of an insight into this, and Columbia and NYU. NYU was the Bloomberg program. And so they're providing these armies of law student time, but also professors. And the professors are helpful for several reasons, but I've noticed they're particularly helpful to provide chin-stroking commentary as disinterested academics who, I approached this skeptically, but when I gave it thought, did I mention I'm an academic? It's come around that these are very important lawsuits. You should watch that 60 Minutes piece on the Climate Kids case. So that's how
we'll put all the links below.
These efforts.
Yeah, we'll put the links below later on. I wonder if we could wrap up by just talking about really what's at stake for the democratic society, without wanting to be too dramatic. But the law is pretty much essential for fair justice. I mean, we all want things to operate fairly and justly, right? Is that what's at stake? Using the courts or the law and fiddling with the law in this way, does that presumably has repercussions beyond just making us greener? That once that you sort of dismantle pretty long-standing institutions of society, Western society, things may stop being so stable, right?
Right. So at first, it may not appear to blur the lines. We know what's necessary. We know why some societies fail, right? You need respect for property rights, transparent judiciary, a respect for the rule of law. We have rule books here. We have Western common law. We have our statutory law. We have rule books. But what happens when we've discussed the double standards? Michael Bloomer is getting away with something that the National Rifle Association or the Petroleum Institute or whomever couldn't get away with, because climate. Someday I'll tell you about the story about the Washington Post reporter getting away. He dismissed the whole Enron story because he tapped his pencil to his head and said, I suppose you could be telling me they weren't that bad after all? I said, where'd you get that? Were you listening at all to me? And he said, well, I mean, global warming. So it's a hall pass. And so if we've got these rules, but this is different, then obviously there are systemic problems. Well, we make exceptions for, you may have seen in our spending debate, well, we have to pay for things, but not the climate. There's 550 billion for climate. Well, that doesn't have to be paid for because it's existential. So you start making exceptions. Do you really have a rule book? Do you have the rule of law? So we have a system. We've agreed to abide by it. This is apparently different. Nonetheless, we know there are various Democratic end runs around their inability to make the case. And one of them is this cop blob, these what Chirac called authentic global governance. And one is lawfare. So we have a treaty, but we'll never get it through the Senate. We learned that with Kyoto. I have an idea. It's not a treaty. But as Barack Obama dared the Senate, what are you going to do about it? And they went, I guess you're right. What are you going to do about it? That's what the attorneys general have been saying all along. But last I checked, I'm the attorney general. So this is, there's a real threat here. We either have a rule book and we stick to it, or we don't. We either require treaties to be approved or we don't. Well, this isn't a treaty because, did I mention it's climate change? There's a lot of exceptions being made because this is different. But dare I say, slippery slope. Obviously, once we start making exceptions, we've made a lot for climate.
Brilliant. Right. Well, terrifying and brilliant. What are we going to do about it? And I think it may be down to people rather than institutions and processes for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us, Chris. And I'm sorry, I feel like we've scratched the surface of a huge story that I hope we'll be able to do more justice to, so to speak. Pardon, in the future. So I hope you'll come back and we can hear more about it. And I will put all the links that you've made references to in the description on YouTube. So I'm sorry, my questions have probably deviated all over the place, viewers, but I will try and get it together for tomorrow. All that's left to say is thank you very much for tuning in. Tomorrow is we're going to have Alex Epstein talking about the morality of climate politics, or so environmentalists like to claim, but we may wish to disagree. So what options are we left with? Thanks very much. Thanks again to Chris. Please stay on the line, Chris. See you all tomorrow.